What's up, everyone? Welcome back to JulioG TV. Today, we are going to determine whether or not the Trump administration is allowed to freeze or withhold funds that have been appropriated by Congress. Let's jump right in. Again, welcome back, everyone. Like I said, today we have another episode of The Decree. Remember, that's the show where I bring you the latest from a local, national, or global perspective with a focus on the legal aspects, as I am a practicing attorney in the state of New Mexico, but with the overall goal of uncovering the truth. So that's The Decree. We got episode 11 today. And like I said, what we're trying to answer is, can the Trump administration freeze, withhold, rescind, waive, whatever word we've heard out there, whether it's from one side or the other or the media coverage? I think it's very hard to answer that question, even though they give us some conclusions, whether it's on the media or other side as to what they believe or what they think. But there's a lot of details that are missing, is what I would say. And so I'm here to bring you those details. Primarily, I'm here to bring you 4 things that you should know and what, Congress can do and what the presidents can do, or what, the executive branch could do, or what the other branch could do. So you need to know 4 things. The first one being, what power does Congress have? What power does the president have? And then there's 2 processes within those powers that we'll also talk about as well. So the first one is Congress. What power do they have? Well, under Article 1, Sections 8 and 9 of the Constitution, under what we call the Appropriations Clause, Congress has what we often refer to as generally as the power of the purse. And so the Constitution states explicitly, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. So what does that mean? Well, Congress has the power of the purse, to approve the spending in the annual or federal budget. So they're the ones who determine, how much, where it's going, what it's for, things of that nature. So they have the power of the purse, so to speak. Now, one of the reasons that they have the power of the purse, I believe, and, we could get more, we won't get into the founders' arguments, things of that nature, but it pretty much ensures that they're accountable to us, and what the will of the people is, even though that's not a straightforward in practice. But I think, that was the idea behind it. So, we elect those representatives and they answer to us, and hopefully our will is reflected in that budget. Things of that nature. And it's, the Congress has that power because the other 2 branches have some other powers, that keep that balance, but also keep that separation of power. So that's it generally. Congress has the power of the purse, set the federal budget. Now, there is one caveat in addition to the 4 factors that I mentioned you want to know here, which is, what type of spending are we talking about here? I don't think we're talking about mandatory spending. I think we're talking about discretionary spending here. And so that's one thing that they failed to tell you out there in the media or on one of the sides is what type of spending are we talking about? Well, we're not talking mandatory because that's passed by law. That's repetitive. That's not necessarily allocated, whether it's through the annual budget or what we have now, the CR, things of that nature, Social Security, Medicare, things of that nature. We're not talking about that. We're talking about discretionary spending, stuff that's you have to, put in that budget yearly, annually, or again through the CR. So again, we're talking discretionary spending here. At least I am at this one, and I think that's what they are talking about as well. Even though there have been some claims that, what the administration is doing is beyond discretionary spending. So, but for what I'm talking about here, that's what we're focusing on. And I believe that's what they should be mentioning as well, that it's discretionary spending. All right. So we have the first thing, Congress's power of the purse, approve spending in the federal budget. The second thing we need to know is that the Constitution also delegates certain powers to the president or the executive branch. Specifically, the Constitution tells the president, okay, you have the task of spending those approved funds, those funds that have been approved by Congress. All right, Mr. President, now you go make sure those get spent. And that power is delegated in what we call the Take Care Clause in the Constitution. And that's found in Article 2, Section 3. Specifically, it says, it requires the chief executive to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. All right, so that's number two. We got number one, Congress's power. Number two, president's power, or what their task is with this approved funding. Now, there's two processes in which can take place, both at the presidential or in the executive branch, or also in the legislative or in Congress. The first one is what we call the apportionment process. This process is pretty much the process of doing that task that the Constitution sets out for the president, of spending those funds. And what the apportionment process is so the president said, okay, I have the power to spend this approved funding. Well, I'm going to delegate that power to the OMB, or what we call the Office of Management and Budget. And they're going to carry out that apportionment process. And so essentially, that power is delegated to OMB, and they now have the task, as we've seen through, the OMB memo, things of that nature, to apportion the enacted appropriations, which were set by Congress, to the agencies, Department of Health and Human Services, USAID, whatever it may be, whatever's been appropriated, now they're going to apportion it in the apportionment process. And they also have to prevent deficiencies and protect that power of the purse of Congress to make sure that it's not ceded or infringed on by the executive branch. Now, apportionments are legally binding, not just through the power delegated by the Constitution to the president, but they're legally binding under federal law and federal statute, specifically Title 31 of the U.S. Code. So, yes, Congress has the power to approve, number one. Number two, yes, the Constitution gives the power to the president to carry out that spending. And number three, by federal law or by the president's power, he delegates that power to OMB to apportion this spending. Now, there's another process in which you've been hearing more about in the news, on both sides, and that's what we call impoundment. And this is what they're essentially stating that the president or the administration is doing currently with some of these, again, freezes, deferrals, rescissions, waivers, whatever you want to call them. They're saying he's pretty much impounding these federal funds. And specifically, what impoundment means is any action or inaction that precludes federal funds from being obligated or spent either temporarily or permanently. And so we first saw impoundment come into play primarily, I think it was under, let's see here, yes, President Nixon. So he took some actions essentially that constituted impoundment. And so Congress took it upon themselves, well, hey, we need to prevent this so that way we keep our power of the purse. And so in the summer of 1974, Congress enacted Public Law 93-344, the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. And essentially Title 10 of that law was the Impoundment Control Act, or the ICA. Again, Congress enacted this ICA in response to attempts by the executive branch to refuse to spend congressionally appropriated funds. The act operates on the constitutional premise that the president must obligate the funds. Like I told you earlier, the power that the Constitution gave the president that he delegated to OMB, OMB has to obligate these funds appropriated by Congress unless otherwise or authorized to withhold them. And so, based upon some actions that were carried out by President Nixon, also we found some impoundment by as early as Jefferson. That's how we got the 1974 ICA, or Impoundment Control Act. Now, again, the ICA banned impoundments, but established a process by which Congress can rescind or even defer certain allocations or appropriations that it made in that federal or annual budget. And so, there's two processes, primarily under Section 1012 or 1012 of the Impoundment Control Act. There's special procedures, and primarily that procedure is to either defer or rescind or cancel those funds that have been appropriated. And I believe 1012 is to rescind or cancel, and Section 1013 is to defer. Now, if the president wants to rescind or defer, the Impoundment Control Act essentially requires that the president transmit what we call a special message to notifying Congress of such deferral. Now, there's a certain timeline of how long they could actually be paused until Congress needs to hear it, or how long Congress has till, it can be rescinded if they choose to do so, or even sometimes they don't have to act. I won't get too deep into that, but essentially just wanted you all to know what factors are in play here, so that way we could see what both sides are saying and, okay, can they do this? Can they not do this? Well, just to recap, now we have these 4 items that I mentioned at the beginning. The first one being power of Congress, power of the president. Okay, within the power of the president, you have the apportionment process, which he delegated to OMB to apportion these funds that have been appropriated by Congress. But given history, what history has shown, Congress took some action back in the 70s to prevent presidents from canceling or deferring funds unless approved by Congress. And so that's where you get the ICA, or the Impoundment Control Act. So now that we have those 4 items, we could see how one side is saying, okay, Mr. President, with your OMB memo, with your rescission, or whatever it may be, Mr. President, I think you're violating the Impoundment Control Act. You haven't sent Congress a message. You haven't sent us anything about trying to defer, rescind, or cancel any message or any appropriated funds. So you're in violation of the impoundment. This is illegal. You're violating, your power. You're going above and beyond your constitutional power. Well, that's one argument. The other argument, and this is how, the Trump administration is somehow, their argument is trying to get around this impoundment control. They're saying, no, we're not impounding funds. We're not trying to delay, even though it may say that we're pausing something. It's not a deferral under the Impoundment Act or Impoundment Control Act. It's not a rescission under the Impoundment Control Act. Actually, what we're doing is we're just trying to, prevent fraud, waste, and abuse, in the spending. That's what Congress has delegated to my office, to the executive branch, to make sure that I apportion these funds for this purpose. Well, we're finding instances in which money is being spent for purposes that haven't been appropriated. Also, we need to make sure that we're directly complying with that power given or required by the Constitution of the executive branch to apportion these, to faithfully execute these laws. And so if there's fraud, waste, and abuse, we can't allow that to move forward without violating that Constitution, or without violating the Constitution, that specific provision, that power that's been conferred upon our office. We can't do that. And, the administration has given some arguments that, again, like I mentioned, they're focusing on discretionary spending. We've heard that come up a little bit, and I think that's where the argument lies. But, they give the example that, okay, us as OMB, or, the executive branch, just to keep it more general, even though Congress has delegated this power or this funding to be spent in this, way per the federal budget or otherwise, us, the executive branch, the president or OMB, we still have to, take a look. We still have to review and approve the expenditure. Essentially, we have to have control of of these operations. And so, if a contract has to be issued to an NGO or a non-governmental organization, we still have to review and approve it. So that's what we're doing. So we're not necessarily, canceling or deferring funds that have been appropriated as the Impoundment Control Act prevents. We're actually just doing what the Constitution requires of us, is to, review and approve these expenditures and make sure there's not fraud, waste, and abuse. In fact, I think here's an extreme from, the administration side is, they're claiming that there's been some, which, that it's mostly the bureaucrats that are causing these issues, which in some cases it could be true, but again, it's very opposite from, okay, this is a violation of the Constitution, this is under the Impoundment Control Act, things of that nature. So again, you have those two extremes. But I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle. And so the Impoundment Control Act, has been challenged a couple of times. In fact, the Supreme Court back in 1975 in the New York City case, did actually find that the Impoundment Control Act was violated by President Nixon. That's kind of what I talked about earlier. But then in the 90s, Congress actually tried to pass a Line Item Veto Act of 1996, which was passed. And that actually gave the opposite side, which is a little ironical here from, President Bill Clinton. It gave him the authority to line item veto 82 items that have been appropriated by Congress. And so then the New York Supreme Court came in on that case and said, whoa, just a minute here. This Line Item Veto Act of 96, it's unconstitutional. And I don't think it's in line with the Impoundment Control Act. So we're going to cancel that. And I don't think we should allow this Line Item Veto Act to move forward. So that was actually shut down as well. Then we also seen another case in which they actually upheld the Impoundment Control Act, but there have been some dissents, by a few justices in the Supreme Court that they say that, hey, presidential power is there, that, whether it's expressed or implied by Congress, his authority is at its maximum. So essentially, saying, I think it's reading more into that constitutional delegation of power, whether it's to Congress or the president, is, maybe the Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional, as some on the right have claimed. So this Impoundment Control Act, I think, hasn't been directly addressed by the Supreme Court in this aspect. I think that it needs to be challenged on the grounds of, whether it's constitutional from a presidential or executive standpoint, meaning, okay, is the president really limited to this amount to where they can't actually prevent fraud or waste and abuse? Are you saying that's the extent of the Impoundment Control Act? Or are you saying, Supreme Court, that the Impoundment Control Act, it does have some exceptions? If there's fraud, waste, and abuse, of course the will of the people don't want that. Even if Congress says spend it for this purpose, but you find that money is going elsewhere, maybe, it kind of fits the mold, but it's not necessarily what's been approved. Then, you could go ahead and exercise that rescission or, deferral or pause until you figure out whether or not it's actually legitimate, or whether you're approving a contract, reviewing it and approving it. Are you, is the apportionment process, in conflict with the Impoundment Control Act? So I think, regardless of the arguments that have been made on each side, Again, the left saying, hey, your violation of Impoundment Control Act, you're exceeding the separation of powers, what you're doing is totally unconstitutional. But then the other side is saying, well, just 1 minute here. We also have power under the Constitution. We're delegated this power to apportion the spending that has been appropriated by Congress. And so in order to do that, we got to make sure that it's been spent appropriately. And we're doing that through the apportionment process. And so now they do have some extreme claims a little bit on the right as well. But I think if you kind of narrow, you do away with some of those extremes and you kind of narrow it down like I did just a minute ago, I think you'll find that the issue is there and it does need to be answered by the Supreme Court. And, whether or not they need to strike down the Impoundment Control Act or they need to reframe it, maybe they need to repeal something and add something, they need to amend it. I think it's necessary so that way this doesn't happen again, specifically with any actions of the president. Now, don't get me wrong. If there is direct impoundment and it could be 100%, well, more likely than not, I would even say, even if it's a foreseeable or even based on something that's reasonable that says, hey, Congress approved this spending. This looks like it fits the mold. The shoe fits, so to speak. You can't defer or rescind that. You need to send the special message to Congress, and we'll figure out whether it needs to be rescinded or deferred. Depending on the funds that have went out, what was approved, things of that nature. So, if it does fit more into that argument of this is impoundment, then yeah, sure, definitely, president needs to follow that currently as that is law. However, on the other side, if it is fraud, waste, and abuse, if it is something that doesn't fit the mold, we don't want those funds going to that purpose, even if it's a good purpose. Well, let's get that before Congress. Let's get them to make an appropriation so we could get that funding there. We need to ensure that the same is true on the other side. So I think there is a common ground here, but I think the way the law currently sits, the Supreme Court needs to interpret it further, see what's constitutional, what is not. And that's whether it's repealing, amending, or otherwise in terms of the apportionment process or the Impoundment Control Act. I think it needs to be done. The last thing I'll leave you with, which is very tough, I think, for some of the individuals that are working at OMB under the president's direction, there's also a sort of a predicament for those folks that are working in OMB because you could technically be committing impoundment, or you could be violating the federal law if you don't follow the apportionment directive. So someone that's, said, hey, you need to go apportion this fund or stop this fund for whatever reason, but it's something that you could, reasonably argue that it's been appropriated by Congress. While now this person has to choose between, okay, do I violate the Impoundment Control Act or do I violate Title 31 of the U.S. Code and get referred to the federal or the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution? I think that's something else that's a huge problem that needs to be fixed. Again, I think the Supreme Court needs to think about, okay, does the problem lie in the apportionment process that's currently in play, or does the problem lie in the Impoundment Control Act? Well, I think we have some conflicting items here that's giving both these narratives some steam, but also giving these, media outlets conclusory statements, that have been pushed upon the masses, and unfortunately, a lot of us are busy, We once relied on the news to be able to give us the information quickly in, bite-sized chunks, so to speak, so that way we could stay informed. But now, we get, unfortunately, for the most part, items that are usually tailored to a certain, ideology or party or whatever it may be. And it's not entirely true. A lot of the details are out, specifically here, like I mentioned. We're just not getting that. If someone, did what I did just now, break it down very, very brief and say, here's the issue. Hey, let's see if the Supreme Court addresses it. It might be one, it might be the other. I would say, listen to that news channel. Or you could follow us, of course, and keep following for, whatever information you bring you. We'll keep supporting it, and like I said, we'll keep trying to uncover the truth and hopefully get there. But again, I think that's what's going to happen. I'll leave you guys with one last thought, or my theory, so to speak. Again, I think the Trump administration or the president is claiming fraud, waste, and abuse, as this would be inconsistent with the laws passed by Congress for the appropriated funds, and in some instances may be consistent with the law. So, again, you have both of those arguments. But what I do think is each one of these items, I think, is going to come down to a factual analysis or case-by-case basis. So that's why I think it's going to be really important for the Supreme Court to weigh in on this, because it's just so factual. Okay, what's this program? What program is it falling under? Does it actually fall under this, line item that Congress put in the federal budget? If it doesn't, what do we got to do about it? Do we get it on the next budget in the next fiscal year? Do we shut it down? Is there a way we could have some balance if it's a really important cause? There's a lot of things to be answered, and it's a very factual analysis. And I think until the Supreme Court, gives us some sort of ruling on this, I think it's going to be a battle for the foreseeable future, and it's really a gray area. I could put any instance, unless it's a reasonable, objective analysis, in either side. So that's what I'll leave you with, guys. To answer the question, I think, unfortunately, we'll see what the Supreme Court says, and we'll see what happens if any laws get passed. But for right now, I think there's good arguments on both sides. We'll have to see how it plays out. Do I think it's a blatant violation of the Constitution? I don't think it gets that far. Do I think it's a wholly approved action by the administration? I don't think it fits in that box plainly either. I think it's yet to be determined, and you could bet on us to bring that to you once it does happen. And I hope it does, because we need that clarification moving forward. Like I said, you could count on us to bring you that information. But until the next one, guys, as I always mention, if you keep supporting, JulioG TV will keep growing. I'll be able to continue to bring this important information to all of you, with the focus of, uncovering the truth. So if you could please do so, just smash that like button, that subscribe button. And if you would like to be notified anytime I upload new videos, you could turn on notifications as well. But I really appreciate you all watching. Until the next one, take care. Peace.